Saturday morning to you. This is Pastor Mark Pierce with Church Requel, and I'm looking forward to sharing Matthew study number 90 with you. Today we want to take a look at Matthew chapter 5 and continue our study of the Sermon on the Mount. We are up to the section where we're looking at Matthew 5 verse 17, and we'll read through verse 20 this morning. Do you think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets? I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, I want to get back to verse 17. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. The idea of the law being that, at least I believe, being that which we see in the Old Testament. As I mentioned yesterday, there really were 4 different ways of thinking about the law, but I believe what we have in our Old Testament comes closest to what Jesus was referring to when he talks about the law or the prophets. Now, it's interesting that he says, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. In fact, there's this word abolish twice in this verse 17. The word for the word is kataluo, which is really a compound word. To loosen would be one word, but to kata loosen, if we were to put it in the Greek/English way, it would be to utterly loosen, or to utterly destroy, or to abolish. So this is a very strong word. Now, you might wonder, why in the world would anyone think that Jesus had come to abolish the law? Well, stop and think about it from a couple of perspectives. Jesus clearly did not follow all of the regulations or the ways of keeping the law that some religious leaders of his day thought that they should. For example, we see illustrations given to us in the Gospels that Jesus was willing to heal on the Sabbath. Now, that might seem like a strange thing to you and I in the West, that of course we would heal someone, but to heal was to do work, and to do work on the Sabbath was considered to be a wrong thing to do. As I understand it, it was okay to, because life was valued, it was okay to do what was necessary to maintain a level of health. For example, if someone needed a bandage, you could put a bandage on someone, but to put ointment on so that it might heal would be to be considered to go too far. And there were other things. Jesus was criticized because his disciples didn't wash their hands in the prescribed way. And certainly Jesus himself proclaimed himself and the Father to be one, which was considered to be utter blasphemy to other religious leaders that might be looking upon him. So there was certainly this idea that Jesus was bringing a whole new way of looking at things, and perhaps was just had in mind destroying everything, or loosening everything, or getting rid of everything that was in the Old Testament. And certainly as we go on to these other verses that we see from Matthew 5, 21 through 48, you get the idea that Jesus is looking at the law in a very different way, perhaps, than what some were looking at it at that time. Now, it would be, I think, disingenuous of us today to simply cast these religious leaders, what are often referred to as Pharisees, in one broad light. It would be kind of like saying today that, and this isn't exactly the same, but in our political circles, to say that every Republican thought the same way, or that every Democrat thought the same way. I mean, the truth is that the Pharisees amongst themselves had a very large debate upon and about how to best to keep the law. And to be, again, extremely fair to them, they went way out of their way to create boundaries so that they wouldn't in any way risk not keeping the law. In other words, they were very serious about how they went about keeping the law, certainly much more so than what many people are today who would consider themselves to be a Christian. So when Jesus says here, don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets, he is saying, I hold this Old Testament teaching in what we also might know as the Torah in very high esteem. This is not something that I have come to abolish. Rather, this is something that I have come to fulfill. Now, when we see the word fulfill, there are a number of ways that we can think about that. Certainly in one regard, Jesus fulfilled the law in that he was a keeper of the law. No doubt about it. He was a Torah-keeping Hebrew Jewish person, and we should never forget that as we look back 2,000 years later. He fulfilled the law by keeping the law. Secondly, Jesus fulfilled the law by teaching the law. What we see throughout much of Matthew, and certainly what we see throughout the rest of Matthew 5, is his teaching on what the law meant and how to go about keeping it. So to keep it himself, yes. To teach it to others and to instruct others in the law, yes. But I think that there is another meaning here, a much grander meaning for the word fulfill, in that Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment of the law. In other words, to fulfill means to fill full, or to be the ultimate direction of the law. In other words, everything that we see in the Old Testament pointing to a Messiah, pointing to that one who would be the anointed one, was fulfilled in Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. And Matthew, certainly more so probably than any other gospel writer, points back to the Old Testament over and over again to show us how it was that Jesus was and is today the fulfillment of the Old Testament law. Now, Jesus goes on to say that not a iota, not a dot would pass away until everything in the law is accomplished. But we also must recognize that almost everything in the law I shouldn't say everything that was in the law in the Old Testament was accomplished in Jesus Christ. And we see much of the rest of the New Testament pointing us as followers of Christ to do the things that Jesus did, to live out the law the way that Jesus did. It's important to us, I think, not to become thinking in our minds that all we need to do is to simply pray a prayer, take kind of a mental checklist of checking something off that we are Christian as opposed to being anything else, and to say, well, that takes care of all of my requirement. Jesus is very clear that if we are to be Christ followers, that we are to do the things that Christ did. And so he spends his time in Matthew chapter 5 and the rest of 5 explaining to us what that means. And I would love to take more time to talk to you about that, but I think we're out of time on this Saturday. I hope that you have a great weekend, and I look forward to talking to you more about this on Monday morning.